You're going.
Says live. Good morning from the campus of the United States Sports Academy in Daphne, Alabama. This is Sports Talk on your Google Hangout. I'm Dr. Arthur Ogden, and I'm your host. And this morning we have to my right Dr. Steve Butler, who is the Dean of Academic Affairs. To my left we have Dr. Tim Foley, the Dean for Student Services. A lot's been happening with the NCAA. We're all aware of it. A lot's been happening with the World Cup. We're all proud of the U.S. team. But this morning we're going to talk about an article that was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education on Monday, the 19th of this month. And the primary author was Brian Porto, Dr. Brian Porto. He has a PhD and a JD. He's a professor of law and director of Sport Law Institute at Vermont Law School. And there are several other authors that go along with it, one of whom is Mary Willingham. You might remember her name. She was the quote whistleblower on some of the less than honorable activities at the University of North Carolina, enrolling athletes into classes that didn't exist or were just kind of paper classes. At any rate, this article is called "The Big Five Power Grab, the Real Threat to College Sports." Now, you all understand when we talk about the Big Five, we're talking about the Big Five conferences: the SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, the Big 10, and out there on the West Coast, the Pac Bunch. And they are asking for autonomy for a number of reasons. Well, this article purports that this is the biggest threat to college athletics. And some of their points simply boil down to these. The threat exists because the Big Five have foolishly put the financial interests of their football and basketball programs ahead of the well-being of college athletes. Now, understand that Dr. Porto, Attorney Porto, is also a member of the Drake Group. The Drake Group, for those of you who may or may not know, was begun in 1999, and its stated purpose was the improvement and integrity of academics for athletes. So anything that seems to take away from that, obviously, is going to be attacked by the Drake Group. Now, the article further says, instead of giving in to the Big Five, the NCAA should clip their wings by denying the group autonomy. Otherwise, the primacy of commerce over education will accelerate, and athletic programs will become more divorced from the educational aims of colleges and universities. Very noble. Moreover, the considerable wealth gap that already exists between the Big Five and the rest of the NCAA Division I would widen as the former reap most of the profits from the new college football playoff. Furthermore, the Big Five conferences view autonomy as a means to control the anticipated pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Not too indicting. We propose in this article that the NCAA own the college football playoff, just as the NCAA, by the way, owns the March Madness basketball tournament, and use the proceeds to provide expanded scholarship support to all Division I athletes. Now, they further on say, and since the Big Five usually earn the most revenue, many argue they should reap the bulk of the profits. But that reasoning presupposes a purely commercial model of college sports. If the games are to remain faithful to the educational setting in which they were born, all members of Division I should share in the bounty from the football playoff so as to increase scholarship support and medical benefits to all athletes. They further state some of the things that already the Big Five conferences are going to institute: athlete injury assistance, cost of attendance, and we've got some numbers on cost of attendance here this morning, an academic trust fund, and the right to arbitration. That is presuming that students will not have four-year scholarships. Their ultimate solution is summed up in this way: The most pressing needs in college sports today are to ensure academic integrity in big-time sports and to enhance athletes' welfare. And this is the scary part. Only the U.S. Congress can achieve these goals by conditioning institutions' continued eligibility for federal financial assistance on their adoption of the reforms outlined above. If the Big Five conferences object, they can leave the NCAA and face the loss of federal funding generally and federal tax preferences for athletic programs. These are arguments, and they're very, very indicting. And I want to start off with the first question. I'm going to give it to my good colleague from the Dean of Academic Affairs, Steve. Do you see this argument as a reduction of the let's let the producers work hard so we can give the benefits to all, even those who do not produce?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I think that what they propose is a little bit out there, but I don't totally disregard the idea of using the threat of withholding federal funding to bring people in line with the academic requirements of schools. And I think, I used the example earlier of even sometimes the threat of federal government intervention is enough to get things going. I believe that's what happened to Major League Baseball. I believe that if Congress wouldn't have drugged those 12 or 15 folks, including Commissioner Buzz Seeley, in front of Congress on national TV, they'd still be hitting 70 home runs a year in Major League Baseball. So it was just the presence of Congress, even though they really didn't do anything that made baseball strengthen its drug policy. I think in this case, I think one of the if you read the article, one of the assumptions that you have to make to believe what they say is true is that the Big Five conferences are the only ones on a money grab. I believe very strongly that the NCAA is just as guilty of being involved in a money grab as the Big Five conferences are.
I think that's a good point. I think that's a really good point. I have a problem with the government intervening, but that's probably because I believe in stronger individual positions and individual rights. And I just don't see that federal legislation or some type of heavy application of certain laws should apply, because the NCAA and its member institutions, for the most part, are either 501c3 entities with their own sets of regulations. But even in a greater sense, Karl Marx wrote in a letter in 1875 called The Critique of the Gotha Program, a very, very famous quotation, which sounds to me like these people are trying to promote. He says, the distribution should fall this way: from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So that means to say that some lower tier Division I group in Louisiana or someplace like that, they really don't put much into the program, but because the SEC schools and the other solid conferences are making all this money in basketball and football, that they too should be given money. Tim, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think administrators need to think about what their goals and objectives are. You know, every school wants to have football. That doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. Again, there was a school that started football out in the West, Division I school. I believe it's categorized under FCS. They had to cut 5 men's teams. So I think that was a poor decision to start football. I did a dissertation topic on this, and one of my ending recommendations was that the FBS schools, under the automatic qualifiers, which these 5 conferences fall under, are able to overcome large football roster sizes to meet the proportionality of the female athletes for Title IX. So I think this group is able has the resources to run successful programs and make successful programs for other athletes. I don't think I can say that for other Division I schools.
At most Division I schools, football comes the closest to paying for itself of all the sports, and the Big Five conference is not only does it pay for itself, it pays for everything else.
And in some ways, this Big Five thing kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you look at it realistically, they have shut out some of the smaller colleges. There's been times when I honestly think some other teams from outside the automatic qualifiers, as we call them, have deserved to be in bowl games, and they weren't, because the Big Five conference commissioners control the bowl selection process and the money. So I think if we broaden the playoff and let more teams in and give other, and I also think that the Big Five conference is what they're talking about doing here. I think it only works for football. I don't think it works for baseball. I don't think it works for I don't even think it works for basketball, because the last two NCAA champions were not from the Big Five conferences. Louisville is moving to a Big Five conference now, but when they won it 2 years ago, they weren't in one of those major conferences. And then last year, Connecticut won it from Conference USA, American, All-American. It was actually a first-year conference. It was kind of like the aftermath of the Big East. But so I don't think this idea of the Big Five going off by themselves works in any sport except for football.
Well, it will also work in basketball, even though you point out some of the other important things about the NCAA tournament. I'm just curious about this whole notion that what this article purports is that there should be legislation, in other words, government intrusion, into the NCAA. I mean, I can understand making recommendations on oversight for better conditions for student athletes, but their proposal essentially boils down to, we're going to take the money that you guys make and we're going to divvy it out to everybody, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Tim, you've got some numbers here about.
Well, one of the problems, speaking of cost of attendance among these Division I schools, I look at one school out in the West. Their cost of attendance is $63,000, and one school right here in our state, the cost of attendance is $28,000. That's a big deal. How are you going to deal with that difference?
Well, and people talk about this, Steve, as pay for play. I don't think it's pay for play. They don't want. All they want is a fair chance to be a regular student. I mean, the difference is, what about the rich kids that can afford to go? Now, the two schools that he points out, by the way, because everybody says, oh, the power schools, like the SEC power schools, they're going to be able to offer more money. That's not what we're talking about. The schools that cost more to attend are going to be able to offer more. The two schools he talked about are Alabama, which is what, $28,000, their budget? And what's the budget here at Stanford? Almost $63,000. But you see, people want to misconstrue this and say, okay, well, we're going to split this up and they're going to get $63,000. No, that's not what's going to happen. Because when cost of attendance is calculated, and these are federal guidelines that they build their budget on so that students can qualify for financial aid, one of the things they count is the cost of living. In other words, how do I get back and forth to school? I'm allowed to include my transportation costs, and I'm allowed to include food costs if I do not live on campus, and so forth. So these things all go into it. My real question about this is, do you think this article, men, is going to make a major impact on the way things are, or is this just an opinion piece that these good people think that they're obliged to do?
I think that these authors have good intentions, but I think it's just one opinion, and there's literally thousands of them out there. And I think you made a good point. Whenever anything like this comes out, the vast majority of people automatically jump to the pay-for-play argument, and that's not what they're talking about at all. When they talk full cost of attendance, why should a student not be given the full cost of attendance instead of just tuition and fees?
Mm-hmm.
You know, because they really do put in a tremendous amount of work. One of the things I found interesting, actually, one of my really good students wrote a paper about college football. I just graded this morning, and one of the things I found very interesting is they surveyed the mission statements of 58 colleges, all of whom are in the Big Five conferences and have obviously had big time football programs. And in only 5 of the 58 mission statements was the word athletics even mentioned.
Right.
So all these schools are in their mission statement are talking almost solely about academics, yet the Big Five conferences want to move to the off under autonomy. These people say for a money grab. If you ask Mike Slive or one of the Big Five commissioners, they'll tell you it's to better meet the needs of the student athlete.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the solution's almost always somewhere in the middle. I think it's never way out here or way out here. It's usually when you stop and think about it, get a whole bunch of smart people together to come up with a reasonable solution, it's usually somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it usually is. And I think that you saw today, well, those of you that, on my smartphone, I have this app called Flipboard. And now the Big Ten is talking about we're going to give 4-year scholarships. And, of course, earlier in the week, Southern Cal tooted its horn about, they're giving 4-year scholarships now. Well, where were they 2 and 3 years ago when everybody else started doing it? That's what I want to know. They want to get the publicity and so forth. The thing of it is, everyone, I think, has finally come to the conclusion that athletes are no longer going to sit back in the back row and continue to have their likenesses being used. The Big Ten for a while, or was the Big 12? Yeah, it was the Big 12, would sell the pictures of their players, and the Big 12 would keep the money. And Jay Billis pointed this out when they were talking about some of the incongruities, that you could go to the UConn website and get the jersey of the basketball jersey of the team members who were playing. So I'm going to close this up by letting Tim, who played Division I baseball at Kansas State, make some final comments about this.
Well, I just think, I think the majority of Division I athletes have a great experience. I think that Division I there's so many differences among Division I institutions. A one-size-fits-all is not going to work. And I think I talked a little bit about that when I talked about the differences between the automatic qualifiers and the Division I schools that don't have football. Again, it's throwing money, giving students, athletes more money. We just gotta. It's not an end-all solution. We got to look at the best way to improve their experience at the Division I level.
I think that's a good point. And one final note: many of these athletes also qualify for Pell Grants. And up until about 12 years ago, maybe it was more like 15 years ago, the schools would keep those Pell Grants. And finally, about 15 years ago, some NCAA legislation came about, through the SEC, by the way, that allowed them to keep their own Pell Grants. And they had to work some kind of miracle with the Title IV fund people, but they're allowed to keep their Pell Grants. At any rate, we want to thank you for joining us again. We, as usual, ran out of time. We don't have enough time. We'd like to remind you, though, that next Wednesday, the July 2nd, we will not be broadcasting. It's kind of a midsummer break, and we'll be back again on July 9th. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great day in sport.